yes, we annexed. We didn't annex. We brought Texas in. She had won her independence from Mexico, and so we brought Texas in as a southern state. And then we had the territories of Arizona, New Mexico came in. California was already a state by 1850, as you know. There was a California regiment, I believe, in the Civil War. Oregon was a state by then. And then we had the Great Plains, or where the nomadic Indian tribes happened to be. The nation expanded. We were 45 states when I led the first United States.
My goodness.
45 states.
We ended up 36.
Well, that's right.
There were two added during the war.
And how do you govern such a state? And not only did the nation itself grow, and this is one of the things that I'm proud about, is the Americans saw a need for us to expand our influence to territories such as the islands of Hawaii. I'm not sure how familiar you are with those Pacific islands. Out in the Pacific, the
Cook Islands.
Oh, yes,
Captain Cook.
very good.
Oh,
Thank
yeah.
you, sir.
How did you
And-
pronounce that?
Hawaiian.
Oh, well, they called it Oahe when I was in office.
I think you're thinking of the land of.
Oahe.
Hawaii.
And I corresponded with the king, Kamehameha, or
Very
Kamahama.
well, yes.
But nonetheless, we called it Oahe.
By
But
the
I
time
don't mean to
we had
interrupt.
annexed those islands, and we had taken over the control of the Philippine Islands, way over toward Japan, and Cuba, Puerto Rico. I mean, the world had expanded, and we had been a part of that world.
Oh, that
which
is
I'm
good
glad
news. See, when our war was going on,
for. Yeah.
the Europeans, from what I understood from one of my secretaries on my cabinet, was very well appraised of world events, Mr. Seward, and he said the kings of Europe were dreadfully concerned that the American system might catch hold in the rest of the world. And so during this war, while we were occupied trying to reassemble our union, 3 European powers sailed over. There had been an election in Mexico, and a man named Benito Juarez was elected and wanted Mexico to become like the United States, free and open. And he threw the Europeans out. And they were in arms. They came over and threw him out of office. He was a refugee in his own country during our war, pleaded for help from us. We couldn't give it to him. And for all the world, I thought that the Europeans were now going to reinstate the divine right of kings. And so you're saying that our influence has actually grown.
Oh,
That's
yeah,
amazing.
absolutely. Yeah, we were a nation, young and vital. We had great dreams when you gentlemen were in. We were sane during your time.
Yeah.
And we've only expanded on that to the point where we became a world power. We Americans had something to say, and by golly, it would do well of Europe to pay attention to us.
That is
It
encouraging.
reminds me of a story. I recall coming back from France, and I would get asked questions as I was a minister plenipotentiary, first under Jay. In any case, I would go to the various activities, and many people said, "Did you meet the kings? Did you meet the earls and dukes?" And I said, in all honesty, there are very few among that class who would be elected a vestryman at any one of our churches.
Well, he's not wrong. I went to the funeral of Edward the Seventh, I believe. I get all those numbers of those kings mixed up. In 1910, I was coming back from a safari in Africa, and he happened to die at that time, and I was asked by the then president if I would represent the United States at the funeral. And quite honestly, I was quite taken with all the European formality and uniforms and all this, the color and the pageantry. And I had planned to wear my Army Rough Rider uniform that I wore in the war with Spain. You know, I was only a colonel.
There was a war with Spain.
Yeah, we had a war with Spain, and we won it, by the way. But Edith, Mrs. Roosevelt, she said, no, Theodore, you're going to wear a tuxedo and top hat, which is the clothing of the day, formal clothing of the day. She said, you're not going to wear that ragged old uniform, but I was kind of proud of it. That's what an American soldier would look like amongst all those kings and queens and such. But that was one of the few disappointments I had as president.
Well, you know, you, the gentlemen, are familiar with Napoleon. His grandson came in the midst of our war and showed up at the doorstep of the executive man. Well, they called it the White House, the People's House. They couldn't make up their mind by the time I lived there what to call the place. But he showed up at the front door one day unannounced and invited himself for dinner, essentially. I really had no time for the man, but Mrs. Lincoln was quite taken with all the fluff and carryings on and they spent the entire evening speaking French, which I had. I was, well, patient, I'll say.
May I interject a story? And I realize our conversation has been quite weighty. But there was an occasion that took place during my administration. I'm sorry, sir, you were not there. But I had an event that took place, and you brought up the emperor. First, he was first consul, and it was due to his decision that I was able to obtain the Louisiana Territory. In any case, once we had made the arrangements and Colonel Monroe and Chancellor Livingston had worked out the negotiation in Paris, then we began to go forward, and Mr. Bonaparte decided he wasn't certain he could trust the Americans to fulfill their responsibility of paying $15 million that had been negotiated. So he sent his younger brother Jerome over. Jerome came, and as it turned out, he went to Baltimore first, and he met a lovely young lady by the name of Miss Patterson. She was the daughter of one of the richest merchants in the New World. And he fell in love with her and married her.
Oh, my.
This was causing some distress for us because here you have someone in this, the aristocrats of Europe have come over and married a commoner. Well, I was hosting her in the executive mansion, and we were going to have a reception. Now, this young lady was very enchanted with the French manners and the French dress, shall I say. And it was at that time, all of the congressmen came to this reception, all of the congressmen's wives, and Mr. Jerome Bonaparte and his new bride entered, and she was, to put it delicately, in a state of dishabille. And all of the congressmen gathered around her. The wives were not happy. I went to my Secretary of State, Mr. Madison, and I said, I have dealt with the political matters. We are dealing with the economic matters. But, sir, if these congressmen are taken home by their wives, we will have no purchase at all. It was, of all people, Mrs. Madison had already ascertained what was happening. She went over to the young lady, wrapped a shawl around her, and escorted her and introduced her to each congressman and his wife. Now, while that did not please each lady, it did allow their husbands to approve for the purchase.
But at
Wisdom.
least she was covered up during the introductions.
Wisdom. My goodness.
You seemed surprised when I mentioned the war with Spain.
Yes.
Well, that was under Mr. McKinley's administration, and it wasn't really much of a war. We won the first battle, we won the last battle, and we won every battle in between. But the Secretary of State was a gentleman you know quite well, Mr. John Hay.
Oh, my goodness.
He
From
advanced.
Pike County.
He advanced very well since he
I
was
expect
your
so, having been
secretary.
a farmer when I
Yeah.
knew him.
And he's the one who kind of gave it its identifying title, if you will. He called it the Splendid Little War. And he was quite right, and that set us on the course to an imperial nature for the nation at the time. But he introduced my father to you, and I don't expect you to remember Theodore Roosevelt Sr., but he also introduced my father to Mrs. Lincoln, and Mrs. Lincoln had asked my father to accompany her on several shopping trips because my father was well versed in the fashions of the time.
Well, Mrs. Lincoln had any number of people who would be willing to go with her on shopping trips. But you know, it's an interesting thing, this idea of the stratified society and the people of import and social standing. When I was elected, I came from a very poor background, and people were incensed, including apparently the King of Spain, which made me think of it, your comments, and according to Mr. Seward, because we were in a civil war, he said that was the logical outcome of a society that allowed the dregs of civilization to ascend to heights to which they had no
Yes.
business going.
Yes.
Oh, my.
And it wasn't just the King of Spain who thought that. It was a good many of educated, well-heeled Americans
Yes.
who thought I had absolutely no business being elected, that it was only a better class of people that should be involved in governing.
Yes.
But the premise of the country has always been that anyone can arise and ascend through all of that paraphernalia to the highest of heights. But even without royalties and without titles and nobilities, it's still difficult. I get to receptions. I used to get to receptions. I don't so much anymore. And they looked at me with the greatest of disdain. And they had no title of nobility. They'd simply been to Harvard and decided that they should have a title of nobility.
Well,
I laugh sometimes
It
because
hasn't
I
changed
believe what Mr. Jefferson said is still true no matter what anybody else says.
Well, unfortunately, in my time as president, it had become more than that. Those classes were there. We talked the talk, but we weren't of the same class and nature as our founding fathers. Money became big money, probably unimaginable to you. The country had gone into a revolution, so to speak, of industry and growth. And
That
you're
was
talking
beginning.
about huge fortunes in which were controlled by just a few men.
Following the European model that we knew.
The aristocracy was that of money, not of
Ah,
birth.
not nobility, okay.
Yes, and the actions were much the same. And reactions were much the same. And if you wanted to gain anywhere in the political world, you had to somehow play their game. And they, and I say they, I mean the gentlemen who have power, they did not much appreciate that. Quite honestly, it took somebody like me who did not have to kowtow to anybody else for money. I did not have to beg anybody to support me. I could say, this is where I stand. You're either with me or against me, or you're waiting to see what happens with it. But that was a rarity, quite honestly. Men were willing to sell their soul in too many instances. It's still a country of dreaming, opportunity.
Yes.